Hi, this is JC Sutherland, Product Manager for M-Audio, and what I'm doing in this video is taking on an overview of the hardware. I'm going to show you each one of the sections and show you how to configure these sections to be specific for your setup. This piece of hardware is very flexible on purpose, so it adds to your current workflow instead of you having to change your workflow. In the opening UI, you have the bank section, the sequence section, preset, sequence, and the push rotary knob, basically telling you what it's doing right now. And the preference is soft key. So what the bank section is telling you right now is that I'm in pad bank A and the controller is in bank A. How I change these sections is I can cycle through by holding the pad bank button and go through B, C, D, or I can hold it down and then use the 1, 2, 3, 4 pads to choose which bank I'm in. The control bank works very similarly by cycling through by pressing the button or holding it down and going to the bank. This also shows you what mode each one of the sections is, and I'll get into that later. Right here we have preset and sequence. What a preset is a preset saves everything, all of your settings for the pads and the controller section. So if you get a really specific you have 64 pads, so if you have 64 pads going to 16 different channels, you're going to want to save that information to call up later easily. And because you can get really specific with these, like the knobs in Mackie, the faders in Midi mode, and these, say, in some sort of arsenal mode, you're going to want to save that too. So you can do the initial setup in your preset and recall that easily. A sequence is saved separately, and what a sequence is basically the sequence, your performance of the hardware. So it's all the MIDI events that you record into the step sequencer and all the parts, because each one of these pads represents a part. So it's like almost having a 64-track MIDI sequencer. So a part in a track is just a different way of stating the same thing. And that's all controlled with the step sequencer. And the reason why it's nice to have these saved separately is that sometimes you might want to have the same sequence but playing through a different setup in the pads or the controls. We also have the preferences soft key here, which goes into the global preferences of the hardware. Right now it's set to send out MIDI channel 1. MIDI out is set to USB and the jack. I can change this to send out just the MIDI DIN, which is the jack setting, or out of USB. I'll just leave it at both. The fixed velocity value is what the velocity is going to be when I have the fixed button highlighted, which basically means no matter how hard I strike the pad, it will always send 127. The sequencer velocity value is the velocity of when I enter steps in a part in the sequence. So this button, if I hit that, that means that this right here is going to be playing the part that I've selected at 127. So if you want to enter in things into the sequencer at a softer value, you just turn this down. The tap LED, you can turn that on and off, because if you're set internally and it's on, it will blink at the tempo. And a lot of people actually kind of find that annoying. So we let you turn that off. And I'll put the clock back to internal and go to the second menu. So you have the brightness and contrast, which basically you can play with that so you get the best view out of the screen. And same with the pad sensitivity, and it has a curve, much like a keyboard controller has a curve. So you can go through those, play it, and determine the best curve for you. What night mode is it shows you the downbeat of each four steps in the sequence. So if you're playing at night, you won't get lost on the sequencer. So if I turn this off, you'll see all of a sudden 1, 5, 9, and 13 are completely dark, where if this is on, they'll be dimmed, so you'll always kind of know where you are, regardless of where you're performing or where you're producing. What the tap average is how many times you need to hit the tap tempo button to actually get the tempo and use the tap tempo feature. So I'll exit out of this menu, and we're going to go to the pad UI focus. First thing, I'm actually going to load an empty sequence so we don't have all these events clouding up on the step sequencer. So I've done that, and now I'll go to the pad focus. What the pad focus does is it puts focus of the UI on the pad controls and lets you operate basically what you want these to be at. It'll keep a lot of the same sequencer values here that aren't necessarily pad specific, but allows you to control things, and so you always know what settings your sequencer is in. Right now the pads are in Arsenal, and what Arsenal mode is this keeps this in lockstep with the Arsenal software. So the pad banks will always be the same. They'll always be sending the same MIDI messages as what you have loaded in Arsenal. However, if you want to get a little bit, have some more fun with this and start sending out different channels, you can put the pads in Midi mode. And I'm actually going to toggle all of these pads to Midi mode to show you. So I'm going to exit out of that, and now I have these new menu items, Edit Pads, and the MIDI mapping. So if I hit the Edit Pads UI, I am now controlling, I'm looking at bank A, pad A, which is this pad, and I can change the minimum velocity value and the max value, which allows me, if I lower the max value down to 100, doesn't matter how hard I hit this, it's only going to hit 100. If I raise this up to like 50, it doesn't matter how soft I hit it, it'll always be 50. So it really kind of just shrinks the dynamic range of the pads as a performance feature, or if you're doing some sort of other thing, maybe not triggering necessarily notes, where that's not an important thing. You can also change the pressure of each pad, which is the aftertouch, from channel, poly, to a CC, and just turn it off. When you hit more, this is when you start really going to town. Right now, the MIDI channel is set to the user preferences, which are the global preferences that we defined earlier in this tutorial, and the output is also sending to that. So if I wanted this to actually just go out the jack port to a hardware synth, I could just change this MIDI channel 1 and straight out to jack. So now this is only sending out the MIDI port and the jack. We'll go back to the user preferences. And I can also change the color of the pads. You can change the on color and the off color. So right now I'm changing the color to green, lime, and if I had that changed, I automatically know, hey, this pad is doing something different. So besides just being able to rainbow out the pads, it's actually a very useful feature when you get to the point where you start specifying what different pads and different parts are doing in the sequencer.